Turning to our final topic here, our lead topic, the Chinese challenging the Monroe Doctrine, if you will, by deepening their partnership with Venezuela. And I say challenging the Monroe Doctrine because, of course, the U.S. has said that China shouldn't be dealing with Venezuela. Venezuela shouldn't be dealing with China. And that's the Democrats in the White House. And it's also the Republicans who are out of office, but in office in Congress, saying that. But rather than running in the opposite direction, the two countries have recently gotten closer. President Nicolás Maduro of Jesus Christ, Venezuela, was just in China for a 7-day trip. He met with President Xi towards the end of the trip. He also met with a number of other high-level officials in Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Shandong. Also did many other various things that we can talk about. But the most notable factor, I think, Rania, that everyone is talking about is they upgraded their partnership, and China, as well as Vietnam, they have these sort of tiers of partnership in terms of not necessarily how close they are. They're close to a lot of countries at the various tiers, but essentially the higher the tier you're in, the more rarefied the relationship. So the top tier is a mutual defense treaty, and there's only one country that they have a mutual defense treaty with. That's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea. The second highest tier is where Venezuela has entered. That's the all-weather friendship. And the only other country that is in that tier is Pakistan. And that's partially why this is so notable, because Pakistan is routinely and correctly listed as essentially the top ally of China anywhere on earth. The two countries are very close. In China, they have a saying they call the Pakistani people the Iron Brothers, and it's the Iron Brotherhood of the two countries, and that's where all weather comes from, is no matter what happens, the alliance will never be broken. Long-standing, 40 or 50 years of that now. So for Venezuela to ascend into that tier is a big statement coming from both countries, of course, but certainly coming from China about what they intend to do moving forward. And the third tier, I'll just note to give people a better sense of this, is the unlimited strategic partnership tier. And of course, if you pay attention to international affairs, you know that is Russia is the only country in that tier. So, they're always talking about China and Russia, very, very close. Well, Venezuela technically now at a higher level. So, technical terms here, but at the end of the day, big shot across the bow from China that rather than run away from the Western Hemisphere, they're going to deepen their relations, even with a country like Venezuela that has been aggressively targeted by the United States.
Well, that's so important you broke that down. I mean, also, just like to put it very simply, Xi Jinping literally called the relationship, he used the word upgrading, that China is upgrading its relationship with Venezuela. And I mean, I think it's really important to emphasize why this is a big deal, because obviously China and Venezuela are already allies, right? They're involved in various organizations together. Of course, also Venezuela wants to be in BRICS. They have not been shy about stating that, and probably will be at some point relatively soon in the near future. And that would just be adding another oil producing country. But obviously BRICS is ideologically diverse. China and Venezuela upgrading their relationship has more to do, I think, Eugene, with this strategic partnership with countries that are targeted by U.S. imperialism. And that's really what has brought them close together, aside from maybe shared values and some sort of historical, well, actually, no, not historical ties, but shared values. I mean, both socialist countries in their own ways. But the point is also, it's you mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, you literally had Donald Trump. I believe it was Donald Trump that called Latin America our backyard.
He's called it that. Biden's called it that. John Kerry's called it that. So it's pretty bipartisan.
Biden called it our front yard. I just thought that was it's Biden was he used the word front yard. It was relatively close to when he became president. So it's regardless of which party's in power, there's a bipartisan consensus that the Monroe Doctrine is still in play. And you repeatedly hear this from American officials. I mean, I think Trump's administration and officials actually use the term Monroe Doctrine to re-invoke it. But even among, Democrats, you do hear the rhetoric of China and Russia better stay out of our hemisphere. And they see it as a huge, almost act of war for China and Russia to have relationships with Venezuela and Cuba and any other country that happens to move a little left. And so I think that the symbolism here, aside from what you mentioned, which is very important, all these agreements that were made to upgrade relations in various capacities, the symbolism here too can't be overstated, because you know that Washington, like in Washington, heads must be exploding because this is like a nightmare. The idea of this is a nightmare. They have fever dreams about China having better, like having greater relationships with people who are, or countries who are in our front yard or backyard. So I just wanted to say, like, and also interestingly enough, like I was perusing the media coverage of it, expecting to see a lot more antagonism about it, but instead it didn't receive as much coverage as I thought it would. I haven't looked on Twitter though, or X. I'm sorry, it's called X now. I imagine there's lots of think tankers making broad statements, but there hasn't been the freak out I expected. Perhaps that's because the media is a bit distracted with North Korea and Russia having a meeting. And not to change the subject too much here, but the New York Times had a very funny headline. It was something like North Korea and Russia find common ground on hostility towards the West. So that was like the front page headline today. So they were a bit too busy, looking at that, I think, to be so focused on China and Venezuela. But I guess we'll see soon.
Yeah, I mean, I think we probably will over the next week have a whole couple articles that are out. I mean, it's also possible a lot of people in the mainstream media haven't fully comprehended the significance. I mean, I think the point that you made there vis-a-vis the United States, I mean, since the era of James Monroe as the president, of course, this has always been the fact that any foreign country knows, to the extent you try to expand your relations in Latin America and you aren't on the same page with the United States, not only, will things happen to those Latin American countries, but you yourself have been targeted. And I have to say, and I think it bears mentioning, I think there are many people who felt that China, even though they had good relations with countries like Venezuela, countries like Cuba, that in some ways they were not as aggressively working with them as they could because they were worried about the United States, having a backlash against them, basically, and having this become another factor and obviously a major attempt by the United States to isolate, demonize China, and ultimately force them to change their policies and or force the government to fall and dismember the country. And I think that in many ways, we talk about the symbolism, speaks to this significance. I think that this is a highly significant shot across the bow by China, that in the context of the so-called rules-based international order where the U.S. makes the rules and everyone else obeys, where I think China's foreign policy has really over the past 20 or 30 years been to not really poke the bear on that issue, quite frankly. But they haven't gotten anything from it. And in fact, over all the time that they have been acting very friendly towards the United States, doing nothing to really obstruct American, will abroad. I mean, they did nothing in the invasion of Libya and other things like that. The United States has only gotten more bellicose and more against China because it isn't about anything that China is doing in terms of America. It's the fact that China is succeeding without, trying to dominate the world and control everybody and everything that America does, right? I mean, the fact that they are not only succeeding, but thriving in many ways and creating really, not even because they set out to create this. I mean, they set out just to create a prosperous country for themselves, but they've now created themselves as a big anchor and pivot that can allow other countries around the world to break free of this, U.S. hegemonic rules-based international order. And so I think in that context of having, for 30 years basically been 100% like, listen, we're not trying to do anything to you. We're just trying to improve the lives of people in our own country. Like, why are you trying to destroy us? I think this is a sign that they're saying, like, okay, fine. After all this time, if you're just going to continue this policy of isolation, of demonization, of trying to destroy our country and strangle it and kneecap our corporations and kick them out of, global commerce to the extent you can, like Huawei, well, fine. Then we're also going to be much more direct with our friends, and we're going to upgrade our relations with countries like Venezuela and provide them and have the type of reciprocal relationship that will be, I think, very, very beneficial for Venezuela and will make it essentially impossible for the U.S. to take them down. I mean, that more or less is, I think to be at the same level as Pakistan, I mean, if you don't follow it, it's hard to know, but you look at things like the China-Pakistan economic corridor, $65 billion of investment, roads, power, all forms of infrastructure being built, ports, special economic zones, the broader issues around the military, other issues of the economy. I mean, essentially, China is putting huge sums of money into helping Pakistan become a more developed nation. And I think you can see with the 30 memorandums of understanding with Venezuela, you're at a similar level, and you're at a level of many of the things that the U.S. tried to sabotage, especially the electrical grid. And they've signed a memorandum of understanding to rebuild the electrical grid. They've signed a memorandum of understanding between CanTV, which is the sort of main telecommunications, state-owned telecommunications, with Huawei around the internet and around cell phones. And if you know what the impact of the sanctions has been on Venezuela, the electrical infrastructure and telephones, cell phones, the internet has been one of the biggest victims of the sanctions because of the various equipment and things like that that are needed. And of course, Venezuela, for most of its history, was closer to the West, closer to the United States. So their equipment deteriorates. The country is sanctioned. They're unable to find replacements. There are other companies around the world that won't sell them replacements because they don't want to get caught up in the sanctions. So they've got bad old equipment. It's tough to get new equipment. And this is, a big problem for people in Venezuela as they struggle to have access to information technology and power. But here is China making a memorandum of understanding to help rebuild the power grid, to help improve the internet, to help improve the cell phone coverage. So this is something, and I'm just giving you one example, that this partnership and this upgrading of ties could have a real tangible impact on improving the lives of people in Venezuela. And of course, they're also opening up China more to Venezuelan goods, and this is one of the big themes of President Maduro's visit, is the opening up of Chinese markets for coffee, for what's blue economy, things, the seafood and the like, which is even more important because of this Japanese dumping of radiation in the seas in that area. So that means countries like Venezuela might be able to capitalize in a big way, selling seafood to China. Sea cucumbers, which is, most people don't know about them, a big delicacy and an important market there in China. Venezuela is going to be entering that as well. There'll be 75 companies featured at the next Chinese import fair there. So not just helping them rebuild their infrastructure, but helping them to create a new export-based economy that isn't strictly relying on oil and on gold and other minerals to help diversify the economy and make it more sustainable moving forward. So you can see on multiple different levels here, and there's many more than what I just mentioned, that upgrading this partnership will heavily strengthen the foundation of Venezuela's efforts to improve its country, improve people's lives. It's obviously a very pro-poor government trying to lift people out of poverty. And President Maduro spoke to that when he met with the head of the commission, basically, that lifted 600 million people out of poverty in China, and said, this is our number one focus is going to be to restore social justice to the country of Venezuela, to have equity, to have, the basic things provided for people and more. And that's partially why this relationship with China is so important, because it gives us the resources to lift up our own people and to change their lives. This is a country that's built 5 million homes, basically free for people who are homeless. It's provided free healthcare, free education, and now they'll have the opportunity to work with China. But I think a big statement from China about the fact that they're just not going to keep getting beaten with the U.S. stick, but they're going to, stand up for themselves and work very hard to build a world where one country can't just dominate everything.
No, I think that's really, really well said. And that's I think a lot of countries are hoping for that. And it's so funny too, how you can really draw a line through how U.S. policy has created the situation.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons Venezuela needs a relationship with China is because the U.S. has isolated it from the rest of the world with sanctions on top of constantly trying to overthrow its government. So one of the things that Venezuela is turning to China for is rebuilding its oil infrastructure, much of which has been somewhat stalled, and it has has lost the ability to refine its oil. At least it did a couple of years ago, because the US was actively using sanctions to prevent it from accessing the materials it needed to refine its oils. And then on top of that, any sanctioned country, we've talked about this on this show before, you have to keep a constant flow of spare parts to replace any sort of big industrial infrastructure, whether it's electricity, whether it's in the oil sector, doesn't matter. You need constant spare parts, and the U.S. sanctions make it almost impossible to have that flow coming in, which is why you have infrastructure like being crippled by sanctions, whether we're talking about Venezuela or Syria or Iran or, especially like in the agricultural industry as well. So the point is, the U.S. has created a situation where Venezuela needs a country like China. And then China, obviously, like the more the U.S. is hostile to China and is aggressive and tries to isolate it and tries to isolate other countries, the more it's going to create these partnerships. So there is something incredibly ironic and almost artistically funny, if I could, I don't know how else to put it, about like how these, DC bureaucrats have no choice but to do this to try to like maintain U.S. hegemony. But it's kind of like the medicine is causing the sickness for them in so many
Yeah.
ways. Of that, it's getting quite late, so my analogies are just going to get worse and worse as time goes by. But I think you know what I'm saying. There's something funny. There's something very ironic and funny to watch a U.S. policy create its own worst nightmare.
No, it's a very good point. And to that point, this is also happening when Honduras, of course, has broken relationship with the region of Taiwan and, restored relations with the People's Republic of China. Nicaragua has done the same thing also this year. Chile, it's not mentioned a lot, but, it's considered a very pro-Western country. They do a ton of business with China. And Brazil, of course, Lula was just there for that huge visit, 7 days, 20 big, deals that were signed. And of course, former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff is now the head of the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank, which is based there in Shanghai. So really all across Latin America, the ties with China only getting deeper, and quite frankly, kind of across a pretty broad ideological spectrum. Argentina is another country that has been getting very, very close to China. I believe that President Fernandez is going to be at the Belt and Road Forum, I think. I'm not 100% sure, but big moves being made there. We'll see if this new very foolish individual becomes president of Argentina, if that remains. But it seems like it very well could, because they're getting a lot economically from that relationship. So you can see all across the continent the extraordinarily deepening ties that are happening between China and many Latin American countries for obvious reasons, because it makes a ton of sense economically for both sides, highly complementary. And just as it would make a ton of sense for the United States to continue the relationship with China, the partnership with China. The two countries are, two of each other's largest trading partners. Makes no sense that we're diverging from all the other countries in our hemisphere and deepening relations and looking to improve people's lives and solve the problems of the globe. But that's the nature of the country we live in, is the ultra-rich, less than 1% of the ruling class doesn't want anyone else on top of the mountain, and they would rather destroy the entire earth than give anyone else a chance to have a word in edgewise or improve their lives.